They called the cops on her because of a bag, a simple, worn bag. But when the truth came out, it left everyone in the cafe speechless. What was in that bag? And why did it lead to such a shocking call? Stay tuned, because this story will change the way you see people forever. Stay with us. The cafe was warm and bustling, filled with the clinking of plates and the hum of quiet conversations. The door swung open, letting in a crisp breeze as a woman stepped inside. She was dressed simply, her coat slightly frayed at the edges, and a worn travel bag hung over her shoulder. She paused briefly, scanning the room before making her way to an empty corner table. Her movements were quiet, almost deliberate, as if she was trying not to draw attention. But attention was exactly what she got. From behind the counter, a waitress, no older than her mid-20s, noticed her immediately. The waitress's expression shifted. What had been a polite, welcoming demeanor turned into one of suspicion. Her eyes darted to the bag slung across the woman's shoulder, then back to the woman's face, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't sit right with her. The veteran sat down, her posture calm but weary. She placed the bag on the floor beside her chair, its scuffed surface telling a story of miles traveled and experiences unknown to anyone in that room. All she wanted was a hot meal and a moment of peace, but she could feel the glances, subtle at first, then more obvious, from around the cafe. The waitress approached cautiously, her eyes lingering on the bag longer than on the woman. "Good morning," she said, her tone polite but stiff. "Can I get you something?" The veteran offered a small smile. "Just coffee for now, please," she replied, her voice steady but soft. She pulled out a small notepad from her coat pocket and began jotting something down, not noticing or perhaps choosing to ignore the way the waitress's gaze kept flickering toward her bag. As the waitress walked back to the counter, she leaned toward her coworker, her voice a whisper but sharp with suspicion. "Did you see her bag?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Something feels off about her." Her coworker shrugged, more focused on pouring drinks than indulging in the waitress's concerns. "She's probably just passing through," he replied dismissively. "Leave her be." But the waitress couldn't let it go. Every time she glanced at the veteran, her focus returned to that bag. What was in it? Why did she carry it so closely? And why did the woman seem so calm, so unaffected by the world around her? The veteran, unaware of the growing tension at the counter, sat quietly, sipping her coffee, as she stared out the window. Her face was serene, but her eyes told a different story, of exhaustion, of miles traveled, of battles fought both on and off the field. She had seen enough of the world to recognize judgment when it was cast her way, but she chose to rise above it, as she always had. Around her, the cafe carried on as usual. Customers chatted, the smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air, and the faint sound of a radio played in the background. But the waitress's unease spread like a ripple, drawing subtle glances from others as she continued to hover near the counter, her gaze never straying far from the woman in the corner. The veteran reached into her bag, pulling out a small, dog-eared book. She opened it, her fingers tracing the worn pages as she began to read. For her, this moment was a rare chance to rest, to feel human again, after a journey that had taken more out of her than she cared to admit. But for the waitress, it was something else entirely, a moment that confirmed her suspicions. "She's hiding something," the waitress muttered under her breath, her voice carrying just enough to catch her co-worker's attention again. "I don't know what it is, but something's not right." The co-worker sighed, glancing toward the veteran. "She's just a customer," he said, his tone firm but uninterested. "You're overthinking it." But the waitress wasn't convinced. To her, that bag wasn't just a bag. It was a question that needed answering, and she was determined to find out. What started as quiet judgment was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous. The air in the cafe grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that no one could quite put into words. What happened next would leave everyone in the room questioning not just the woman with the bag, but themselves. The waitress couldn't shake her unease. She stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot repeatedly, her eyes flickering toward the veteran seated in the corner. The bag, worn and scuffed from years of use, seemed harmless enough to anyone else. But to the waitress, it was something more, something that didn't sit right. "She's been sitting there too long," she whispered to her coworker, her voice low but sharp. "And that bag, I don't know, it's weird." The coworker barely looked up from the register, his tone dismissive. "It's just a bag, probably full of clothes or books, let it go." But the waitress shook her head, her brow furrowing. "You don't think it's odd?" She walked in, barely said a word, and now she's just sitting there, staring out the window like she's waiting for something. Her voice dropped even lower. What if she's planning something? The coworker stopped what he was doing and turned to her, his expression incredulous. "Planning something? Seriously? She looks tired, not dangerous." But the waitress wouldn't budge. Every time the veteran shifted in her seat or reached into her bag, the waitress's imagination ran wild. "You hear about those stories all the time," she muttered. "People walking into places like this, acting normal, and then—" Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. The veteran, unaware of the mounting suspicion, continued to sit quietly. She occasionally sipped her coffee, her gaze distant, as if lost in thought. When she pulled out a small notebook and pen, jotting something down, the waitress's anxiety spiked. "What's she writing?" the waitress asked her coworker, her voice almost frantic. "Why would she need to take notes in a cafe?" The coworker sighed, clearly irritated. "Maybe she's making a grocery list, or writing in a journal. Not everything is a conspiracy, you know." But the waitress's mind was already racing. She leaned closer to another staff member who was arranging pastries in the display case. "Do you think we should say something?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The second co-worker glanced at the veteran, then shrugged. "Say something about what? She hasn't done anything." "Not yet," the waitress replied, her tone heavy with implication. "But what if she does? What if we're sitting here, ignoring the signs, and then it's too late?" The second co-worker straightened up, giving the waitress a concerned look. "You're overthinking this," she said firmly. "She's just a customer." But the waitress wasn't convinced. She hovered near the counter, stealing glances at the veteran every chance she got. To her, the bag wasn't just luggage. It was a question, a threat, a reason to fear. The veteran reached into her bag again, pulling out a small object wrapped in cloth. Her movements were calm and deliberate, but to the waitress, they felt calculated. "What's she doing now?" the waitress hissed to herself, her nerves fraying. The object turned out to be a photograph, which the veteran placed gently on the table. She stared at it for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But the waitress's suspicions only deepened. "She's trying to look normal," she muttered. "But something's off. I can feel it." Her co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with her growing paranoia. "Maybe you should take a break," one of them suggested, trying to diffuse the tension. But the waitress shook her head. "Number, I need to keep an eye on her, just in case." Her fixation on the veteran became more obvious as the minutes ticked by, drawing subtle glances from customers who noticed her strange behavior. The veteran, however, remained oblivious, engrossed in her quiet moment of reflection. The waitress, unable to let go of her assumptions, felt the weight of her own fear pressing down on her. It wasn't just about the bag anymore. It was about everything she didn't understand. And in her mind, that was reason enough to act. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she hesitated before dialing. The decision she was about to make would change the course of the morning and leave everyone in the cafe questioning her judgment. The waitress had finally reached her breaking point. Every glance at the veteran's bag sent her thoughts spiraling further, her imagination turning the ordinary into something dangerous. She took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked briskly toward the veteran's table. The quiet hum of the cafe seemed to pause, the tension in the air palpable as she approached. "Excuse me," the waitress began, her voice sharper than she intended. The veteran looked up from her notebook, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. The waitress hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the bag on the floor. I just wanted to ask, what's in the bag?" she said, her voice low but firm. The veteran's brow furrowed slightly, but her tone remained steady. "Why do you need to know what's in my bag?" she replied. "I'm just sitting here, having coffee." The waitress shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if seeking backup. "It's just, we've had incidents before," she said, her voice growing louder. "People coming in with bags like that, acting suspicious. I'm just trying to keep everyone safe." The veteran's expression hardened. "I'm not acting suspicious," she said firmly. "I'm sitting quietly, minding my own business. If you're concerned, that's on you." The exchange began to draw the attention of other patrons, their conversations falling silent as they turned to watch. A man at a nearby table frowned, leaning slightly closer to hear what was going on. The waitress's voice rose, betraying her growing anxiety. "I don't feel safe," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I need to know what's in that bag." The veteran leaned back in her chair, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said. "I came here for a cup of coffee, not an interrogation." The tension in the room thickened, the quiet murmurs of the other customers underscoring the escalating confrontation. The waitress, feeling the eyes of the room on her, crossed her arms. "If you're not going to tell me, I'll have to call someone who can deal with this." The veteran's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. "If you feel the need to escalate this, that's your choice, but you'll regret it when you realize you're wrong." The waitress hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone in her apron pocket. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but her fear overrode her better judgment. "I'm sorry, but I can't ignore this," she said, pulling out her phone and dialing 911. The cafe fell silent, the quiet buzz of earlier replaced by an uneasy tension. Customers exchanged glances, some visibly uncomfortable, others openly disapproving. The man at the nearby table muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The veteran sat silently, her eyes locked on the waitress, who now spoke into the phone. "Yes, I need assistance," the waitress said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a woman here with a suspicious bag, and I don't feel safe. Can you send someone?" The veteran exhaled slowly, her hands resting on the table as she maintained her composure. She could feel the stares of the other patrons, the weight of their assumptions hanging heavy in the air, but she refused to react, knowing that any sign of frustration or anger would only validate the waitress's fears. As the waitress hung up, the room remained tense, the sound of her footsteps as she retreated to the counter echoing in the quiet cafe. The veteran, still calm, picked up her coffee and took a slow sip, her gaze unwavering. She knew the situation was about to escalate, but she also knew she had nothing to hide. For now she would wait and let the truth speak for itself. The sharp wail of sirens broke through the morning quiet, signaling the arrival of the police. The cafe's already tense atmosphere thickened as two officers stepped through the door, their faces set with professional detachment. All eyes turned toward the veteran, who sat calmly at her table, her hands folded neatly on the surface. She didn't flinch, didn't move. She simply watched as the officers approached. The first officer, a middle-aged man with a steady demeanor, scanned the room before focusing on the waitress, who stood nervously behind the counter. "You called?" he asked, his tone even but clipped. The waitress nodded, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Yes, that woman over there," she said, gesturing toward the veteran. "She has a suspicious bag. I don't feel safe." The officers exchanged a glance before approaching the veteran's table. The second officer, younger and visibly cautious, positioned himself slightly to the side, his hand hovering near his holster. The first officer addressed the veteran directly. "Ma'am, we received a call about you. Do you mind telling us what's in the bag?" The veteran looked up at him, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I do mind, actually," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I've been sitting here, drinking my coffee and bothering no one. If you think I've done something wrong, say it. Otherwise, this is harassment." The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her confidence. He glanced back at the waitress, who was watching anxiously from behind the counter. "It's standard procedure," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We just want to make sure everything is okay." The veteran leaned back slightly in her chair, her composure unwavering. "If you're here because someone made an assumption about me, then it's not okay," she said. "I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else in this cafe. You wouldn't ask anyone else in here to explain themselves, so why are you asking me?" The younger officer stepped forward, his voice more hesitant. "Ma'am, we're just trying to do our job. If you could cooperate—" "Cooperate with what?" she interrupted, her voice growing firmer. "I've done nothing wrong. My only crime is sitting here while carrying a bag that apparently makes people uncomfortable. Is that against the law now?" The cafe was silent, the tension palpable, as the officers exchanged another glance. The first officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but if we could just take a quick look at your bag, we can clear this up and move on." The veteran's jaw tightened, her patience visibly wearing thin. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but resolute. "I've served this country. I've carried more weight than you can imagine, both in this bag and on my shoulders. And I will not be treated like a criminal because someone decided I didn't belong here." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their confidence wavering in the face of her conviction. The younger officer looked down, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The first officer took a step back, his expression softening. "Ma'am, we're not trying to accuse you of anything, but we do need to resolve this." The veteran exhaled slowly, her gaze never leaving theirs. "Then do your job," she said. "But you'll find nothing here except proof that this was a mistake." The officers nodded, the tension between them and the veteran hanging heavy in the air as they prepared to proceed. Around the cafe, the quiet murmurs of customers reflected a mix of unease and growing doubt about the waitress's judgment. The scene was charged, every movement slow and deliberate, as the officers began to take the next step. The truth, whatever it was about to be revealed. The cafe was so quiet that the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed deafening. All eyes were on the veteran as the officers stood by her table, waiting for her response. She reached down, her movements deliberate and calm, lifting the worn bag from the floor and placing it gently on the table. The scuffs and frayed edges of the bag told a story of miles traveled, hardships endured, and experiences that no one else in the room could begin to imagine. "If you want to look, go ahead," the veteran said, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of exhaustion. "But you'll see this bag holds my life, not the threat you've all imagined." The first officer hesitated, glancing at her as if silently seeking confirmation. She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. He slowly unzipped the bag, the sound of the zipper cutting through the heavy silence. The cafe's patrons leaned forward in their seats, craning their necks to see what would emerge. The first item the officer pulled out was a neatly folded shirt, its fabric worn but clean. Then a small toiletry bag, followed by a pair of old but sturdy boots. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the essentials of someone constantly on the move. Then the officer reached deeper and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Carefully unwrapping it, he revealed a framed photograph of a military unit, their faces young and proud, standing in formation against the backdrop of a distant desert. The veteran's gaze softened as she saw it, her expression tinged with both pride and sorrow. "What's this?" the younger officer asked, his tone no longer guarded, but curious. "That's my unit," the veteran replied simply. "The people I served with, some of them didn't make it back." The officer carefully set the photo aside and continued. The next item was a medal, its gleaming surface catching the light. It was unmistakable, a Medal of Honor, the highest recognition for valor in service. Gasps rippled through the cafe as the room collectively realized the weight of what they were seeing. The waitress, who had been standing near the counter, froze, her face paling. She took a small step back, her earlier confidence replaced by visible regret. A man at a nearby table muttered, "Oh my God," while another customer whispered, "She's a hero." The first officer straightened, holding the medal carefully before placing it back into the bag. He looked at the veteran, his expression a mix of respect and remorse. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice quieter now. "We shouldn't have doubted you." The veteran's eyes remained steady, her composure unbroken. "You didn't just doubt me," she replied. "You judged me. You assumed I was a threat because I didn't fit the picture of who you thought I should be." The officers stepped back, their discomfort evident as the gravity of their mistake sank in. The patrons in the cafe sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Inside that bag wasn't a threat. It was a life dedicated to serving her country. It was a collection of memories, sacrifices, and honors that few could ever truly understand. And yet, despite all she had given, she had been treated with suspicion and fear. The veteran reached for the bag, gently packing her belongings back inside. The photograph and medal seemed to glow with significance as she handled them with care. The room remained silent, every person present grappling with their own assumptions and judgments. The waitress took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling as she tried to speak. But the veteran raised a hand, stopping her. "Not now," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Let me finish my coffee." And with that she sat back in her chair, the quiet strength of her presence speaking louder than any words could. The cafe remained eerily silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The veteran's quiet dignity, the gleaming medal, and the framed photograph resting briefly on the table had transformed the room. Conversation stopped, forks paused mid-air, and all eyes were now fixed on the woman who had been so unjustly judged. The first officer cleared his throat, his professional demeanor cracking under the strain of what had just unfolded. He exchanged a glance with his younger partner, both of them visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "again, we're sorry for the inconvenience." The veteran didn't reply immediately. She sipped her coffee slowly, her calm composure contrasting with the growing unease in the room. Finally she looked up, her gaze steady. "It's not just an inconvenience," she said, her voice firm but devoid of malice. "It's a reminder of how easily people make assumptions, assumptions that can hurt, assumptions that can humiliate." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone in the cafe. Customers began to exchange guilty glances, their initial curiosity now replaced with discomfort. The man who had muttered earlier shook his head and whispered to his companion, "We all just sat here and let it happen." At the counter, the waitress stood frozen, her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. She stared at the table where the veteran sat, her earlier confidence now replaced by visible regret. The realization of what she had done, her actions driven by fear and baseless suspicion, was sinking in. I didn't mean," she started, her voice barely audible. But the veteran didn't look her way. Instead, she focused on the officers, her calm gaze cutting through the silence. "You were doing your job," the veteran said to the officers, her tone neutral. "But her?" She gestured subtly toward the waitress without turning her head. "She wasn't doing hers. She judged me before she knew me, and that judgment brought you here." The waitress flinched, as if the words were a physical blow. Her co-worker, who had tried earlier to downplay her concerns, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You should apologize," he whispered. The veteran leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on the table. "The funny thing is, I've faced far worse than this," she continued, her voice steady but carrying a quiet edge. "I've been in situations where making assumptions could cost lives. Out there in the field, you learn to look beyond the surface. You learn to see people for who they really are." A woman seated nearby, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Her words seemed to break the tension, and a few others murmured their agreement, their voices soft but sincere. The waitress's eyes welled up, and she stepped forward, her voice shaky. "I'm so sorry," she said, her words tumbling out quickly. I didn't mean to offend you. I thought I was doing the right thing." The veteran finally looked at her, her expression unreadable. She held the waitress's gaze for a moment before responding. "You weren't trying to do the right thing," she said evenly. "You were trying to make yourself feel safe, and you did that at my expense." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was a reckoning. The people in the room weren't just grappling with what had happened. They were reflecting on their own biases, their own assumptions, and the role they played in allowing such moments to unfold. The veteran stood, her movements measured and deliberate. She picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder, and left a few bills on the table to cover her coffee. "Next time," she said, looking directly at the waitress, "think before you act. And if you're not sure, ask yourself, is this about them or about me?" With that, she walked to the door, her back straight and her presence commanding. The room remained silent as the door swung shut behind her, the sound of the bell above it echoing in the heavy quiet. No one moved, no one spoke. For the first time, the people in that cafe truly understood the weight of what they had just witnessed. The door had barely closed behind the veteran when the weight of what had just transpired hit the waitress. She stood frozen by the counter, her hands clutching the edge as if to steady herself. The chatter in the cafe was subdued, with whispers and glances aimed in her direction. Her co-workers avoided her gaze, their silence speaking volumes. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice trembling as she muttered, "I didn't mean to offend her." The words felt weak, hollow, and even as they left her mouth, she knew they weren't enough. One of her co-workers gave her a pointed look. "Then why did you do it?" he asked softly, his tone neither accusing nor kind, but filled with quiet disappointment. The waitress looked down at her hands, twisting a corner of her apron nervously. I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice faltering. "I thought I was protecting everyone." A man sitting near the counter shook his head, his tone firm but calm. "Protecting everyone from what? A woman having a cup of coffee?" His words hung in the air, forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. She turned toward the officers still standing by the now empty table. She didn't look like she belonged here. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The older officer sighed, his expression tired. "Sometimes fear isn't enough of an excuse," he said. "You have to be better than that." The waitress nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll apologize if I see her again," she whispered, though even she didn't seem convinced it would make a difference. The veteran hadn't gone far. She stood just outside the cafe, taking a moment to gather herself before walking back in. Her presence silenced the room once more, the sound of the door's bell marking her return. The waitress looked up, her face pale, as the veteran walked toward her. "Ma'am," the waitress began, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" The veteran raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Don't apologize if you don't understand what you're apologizing for," she said, her tone calm but firm. "This isn't about making you feel better. It's about making sure you don't do this to someone else." The waitress nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the right words. The veteran turned to face the entire cafe, her voice carrying the weight of her experience. "I've spent my life fighting for this country," she began, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "I've worn this uniform, carried this bag, and stood on the front line so people like you could feel safe. And yet, here I am, treated like a threat because I don't fit someone's idea of what safe looks like." The room remained silent, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. She gestured to the bag at her side. "This bag carries memories. It carries the weight of friends I lost, the sacrifices I made, and the service I gave. But to you?" She turned toward the waitress, her gaze piercing. It was just an excuse to assume the worst. The waitress's tears spilled over, her head bowing under the weight of the veteran's words. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, barely audible. The veteran softened slightly, her tone no longer sharp, but still resolute. "It's not about being sorry, it's about doing better. It's about seeing people for who they are, not what you think they might be. Because if you can't do that, then you're part of the problem." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "We all have biases," she continued, "but we have to challenge them, not let them define how we treat each other. I didn't come here to teach anyone a lesson. I came here for coffee. But if this moment can make even one of you think differently, then maybe it was worth it." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe, the patrons nodding silently. The veteran turned back to the waitress, her expression softening further. "Do better," she said simply. "That's all I ask." With that, she turned and left again, the room's silence now filled with reflection rather than tension. The weight of her words lingered long after she was gone, leaving everyone in the cafe with a renewed sense of accountability and the understanding that change begins with each of them. The cafe manager, a middle-aged man with a nervous expression, stepped out from the back office, having heard about the escalating situation. The tension in the room was palpable, and the weight of the veteran's words still hung heavily in the air. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and approached the veteran, who was preparing to leave once again. "Ma'am," he began, his voice hesitant but earnest, "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. What you experienced was unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the values we stand for as a business." The veteran paused, her bag slung over her shoulder, and turned to face him. Her expression was calm, though her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had endured far too much in one morning. She didn't interrupt, allowing him to continue. "I understand if you're upset," the manager said, glancing nervously toward the waitress, who stood nearby, her head bowed. "I can assure you, we'll be taking steps to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The veteran remained silent, her gaze unwavering. The manager took a step closer, lowering his voice as if trying to make the moment more personal. "Please let us make it up to you, your coffee, your meal, everything today is on the house." The room was silent, all eyes on the veteran as she considered his words. After a moment, she shook her head slowly, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't about a free meal," she said. "It's about changing the way you see people." The manager looked taken aback, unsure of how to respond. I understand," he stammered, though it was clear he didn't fully grasp the depth of her words. The veteran took a step forward, her voice carrying an air of quiet authority. "An apology is a good start," she said, "but it's not enough. If you want to make things right, then don't just address this moment. Address the attitudes that made it possible in the first place." The manager nodded quickly, his expression earnest. "We'll do better," he promised. "We'll implement training for our staff, bias awareness, sensitivity, whatever it takes. I can't change what happened today, but I'll do everything I can to prevent it from happening again." The veteran studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. "That's a step in the right direction," she said. "But remember, Change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from actions, from how you treat people every single day. She turned toward the door, her voice calm but resolute as she added, "Respect isn't something you can buy with a free meal or an apology. It's something you show in how you see and treat others. Start there." The manager watched as she walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door ringing softly in her wake. Around the room, patrons sat in reflective silence, her words echoing in their minds. For the first time, the weight of what had happened and what it represented was truly sinking in. The waitress wiped a tear from her cheek, whispering to the manager, "She's right." He nodded, his face thoughtful, as he turned back to the counter, already making plans to ensure the veteran's words would lead to meaningful change. The veteran may have declined their offer, but her message was clear. True reconciliation would come only through understanding, accountability, and the commitment to do better. A bystander at the cafe, quietly recording the confrontation on their phone, had no idea how powerful the footage would become. The video captured every detail: the waitress's suspicion, the arrival of the police, the inspection of the veteran's bag, and, most importantly, the dignity with which the veteran carried herself throughout the ordeal. By the end of the day, the video had been posted online, quickly gaining traction. The caption read, "Waitress suspects veteran of wrongdoing. Police reveal her Medal of Honor." Within hours, it spread across social media platforms, sparking widespread outrage. Comments flooded in as people shared their disbelief and anger. "How could they treat her like that?" one person wrote. Another added, "She's a hero, and this is how we repay her service?" News outlets picked up the story, replaying the video and interviewing the person who had captured the footage. "It was heartbreaking to watch," the bystander said. "She was so calm, so composed, but you could tell this wasn't the first time she'd been judged unfairly." The video quickly became a symbol of a larger issue: how prejudice and bias manifest in everyday life. Millions watched as a decorated veteran stood tall against unfounded suspicion, reminding everyone what dignity looks like. Hashtags like "Respect our veterans and stop the bias" trended nationwide, sparking a broader conversation about how society treats those who have sacrificed so much. The cafe, meanwhile, found itself at the center of the storm. The owner issued a statement apologizing for the incident and promising to implement staff training to prevent similar situations. But for many, the apology felt hollow. "People didn't just want an apology, they demanded real change," said one local activist. Community leaders and veteran organizations rallied around the veteran, using the moment to highlight the challenges many veterans face when reintegrating into civilian life. "This isn't just about one person," a spokesperson for a local veterans group said during a rally. "It's about ensuring that all veterans are treated with the respect they deserve, no matter where they go or what they carry with them." The backlash against the cafe was swift. Online reviews plummeted, with angry customers calling out the business for its treatment of the veteran. "I won't step foot in a place that disrespects those who served," one reviewer wrote. Protests outside the cafe became a daily occurrence, with signs reading, "Respect starts here," and "No room for bias." Amid the chaos, the veteran remained quiet, allowing the incident to speak for itself. When approached for interviews, she declined most, choosing instead to issue a single statement. Standing before a group of reporters, she spoke directly to the cameras, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't about me," she began. "It's about how we see each other. It's about challenging the assumptions we make and the judgments we pass before we truly know someone." She paused, her gaze steady. "Respect starts with a choice, to see people for who they are, not what you assume them to be. I've carried this bag and this medal for years, not for recognition, but as a reminder of the sacrifices made by so many. And yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. All they saw was a threat." Her words resonated deeply, sparking even more conversations online and in local communities. Schools held discussions on bias and judgment, while workplaces introduced training sessions inspired by the incident. The veteran's story became a catalyst for change, a moment that encouraged people to look inward and reflect on their own behavior. Don't let this be just another story you watch and forget. Let it be a moment that inspires you to think differently, to act with kindness, and to treat everyone with the dignity they deserve, because real change starts with each of us. The veteran's words echoed across social media, news channels, and conversations in homes and workplaces. Her calm, unwavering strength turned what could have been another forgotten incident into a movement that inspired hope and demanded accountability. And as her story continued to spread, it served as a reminder that respect isn't just given. It's earned through understanding, empathy, and the courage to see beyond the surface.